Okay, hi. I hope this is live, and I'm also recording. This setting may be familiar to some of you from my other classes. So this is my, roughly hour or so intro lecture to B75. Hollywood cinematic genres. It's a companion class to B76, also Hollywood cinematic genres. The difference being that we cover three genres in each, B75 and B76, but they're different genres. So B76 was last taught this past winter. Some of you may be alumni of that class, in which case we looked at horror, romance, and science fiction. And in this class, we're going to be looking at melodrama, film noir, and the Western. So the underlying premise of both classes is the same. You don't have to, there's no prereq that you take B75 before B76 or vice versa. What the classes have in common is it's the study of cinematic genre, but it's three different genres. So there's overlap. If you've had one of the classes, then you've already seen me put cinematic genre formations in dialogue with unresolvable problems of modernity relative to the individual self, because that's what all genres deal with. In six different ways. I could also do the musical, but I haven't fit that into this particular paradigm. So we should begin with what is the relationship between cinematic genre and modernity, cinema and the modern experience of reality. So this overlaps to a certain degree with issues that become prominent in A10 and in A11. But again, you don't need those classes for this. All my classes are kind of self-sufficient, but they're also they're rhizomatic, a term I use a lot. There's underlying structures that show up in A10, and any class I teach, the body. But there's different iterations, very different iterations of the basis. So the more classes you have with me, the more you'll run into infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure. And that's, in that sense, I suppose subsequent classes you might benefit from the overlap, but I try and teach the classes so that if it's your first class or with me, and if it winds up being your only class with me, it's self-sufficient. I give you the basis of what you need for what's happening in that class. So you don't have to worry about, oh, should I take that other class, or did he say something in some other class that I need to know? I don't think so. At least that's not my approach. This is one-stop shopping in that sense. I'll give you everything you need. If you've had A10, A11, you may find yourself translating subtly, like, oh yeah, that's he brought that up in A10 now. And in general, A10 is an A11 or general. And then things get more specific in a class like the body and literature, or cinematic genres, or the seminar on James Joyce or Alfred Hitchcock or Stanley Kubrick, or that sort of thing. So the metaphor, now you have a long piece, 25-page piece, I think, that I posted 3 substantial essays under the discussion tab. One on melodrama, one on film noir, one on the Western. So that the one on the melodrama will be touching base with that document for the next 3 or 4 lectures. So you can read it through once quickly. You can get through half of it, read it, reread it, print it out, highlight it. It's a background piece. What you'll get in my lectures, in the 4 lectures I'm going to do on melodrama, is a more specific focus on particular film. So, and then we have a synchronous meeting every Monday, 7 to 9, but it's taped, or should be. So there's no penalty for not being able to make it live. I do appreciate it when you can, because it's supposed to have a discussion element. I'll be giving you a prompt every week, and I probably allude to that tonight. And I'll print in announcements what the prompt is. And so what the prompt is a weekly 300-word response to something. So this first prompt will have something to do with melodrama, and ideally, and that again, it's not absolute because I know deadlines are kind of meaningless in some ways, especially in this virtual COVID era. If you can get the prompt done before Monday evening, that helps me. I don't need every single prompt from every single classmate to have something to react to. I will go through and put comments from time to time. They're not meant to be, I'm not grading them exactly. I'm commenting. The sooner if you can get your prompt in before the Monday night, I'm more likely to comment on it because I'll be sort of trying to tee up that particular class, and less likely to circle back. But within a week or two, I look at that and I read them all. You'll have a cumulative grade for all the prompts, but you'll get by the by the end of the year. And I think I give you an interim, sort of midtermish, or maybe shortly after, of basically your prompts are graded 0 to 3 by the TAs. A 0 typically means you didn't do it. 1 means you did it not much beyond just reciting something, and then 2 or 3, it's kind of marks your engagement with the question. You can go beyond 300 words. I set 300 words as a baseline just so that you're not overwhelmed by the assignment, but it's not meant to cut you off either. So if you find you're kind of rolling, and the other reason I like these prompts, because the other two grading mechanisms in this class are the midterm and the final, which are both essays that get posted. And you have a 4-day window to find the 3 or 4 hours I think it might take to do it. But the prompts are a bit more personal. They're a little like the journal entries in A10, A11, if that means anything to you, where I'll often invite you to bring in an ad, or I'll ask you to respond to ads or songs or clips. And it's okay to extemporize a little. You can definitely use I in discussing it. I think, I wonder. And the prompt is meant to be open-ended. Another advantage of the prompt. You're not trying to answer. That's why I call it a prompt and not a essay question. It's meant to prompt you into thinking out loud about it. Some of you know about how I do free writes, and I may occasionally do a free write in the synchronous Monday night, but the prompt has a degree of free write to it, where I'm just prompting you to think about this, write down thoughts. So it's okay to be quote unquote confused in the course of your prompt and say, well, I think melodrama is this, but then again, I don't know, because I didn't understand why this happened in Broken Blossoms, and how is that melodrama? So asking questions, asserting a theory, all of that's fair game, because it's meant, in some ways, I give you a prompt, you give 300 words, those 300 words come back to prompt me a little bit, help orient me, especially as the class progresses. The prompts help me get a sense of where you guys are, which is one of the biggest challenges of this COVID stuff, is locating you. I don't have you in front of me as much, and even when you're synchronous, it's Zoom and faces pop in and out. I encourage you to pop on screen, but I don't demand it. You can also you can ask questions audio when we're in the synchronous section. You can use the chat. Now the chat kind of explodes sometimes, and I look for questions, but sometimes it's simple things like, oh yeah, I noticed that too, and that's great. So I will keep an eye on the chat scroll as much as I can during the synchronous session. But if it's, you'll probably want to pipe up, raise your hand, interrupt me, and raise your hand at any point, even though I'm in the middle of a sentence, because I can continue my thought, and then I'll say, yeah, Barbara, what's up? Tom, what's going on? What do you think? And I'll get to you. so put the hand up and understand this sometimes as a cue. So maybe you can see the hands that are up too. I'm not sure, but you'll have some sense of me moving through the raised hands. Anytime, 24/7. I won't be necessarily monitoring 24/7, but I would say every 24 hours. My email, leonardgarry@hotmail.com, leonardgarry@hotmail.com. That is good for anything you want it to be. It can be a comment on class, it can be a question, it can be a clerical question like when's the midterm, what's the percentage. If I see questions that are obviously of general interest, I often will mention it on announcements, like some students have been asking X, here's the deal. If you're sick or there's an issue going on and you're trying to sync up what's going on in your life with how you are attending the class, send it to leonardgarry@hotmail.com and I can work with you. It's wide open. You people are literally all over the world. There's COVID going on. Family gets sick, you get sick. It's, we have to stay, as the US military likes to say, it's a dynamic fluid situation, which really means they don't know what's going on. But in a sense, I don't either. I don't know what's going on out there. What I do know is I've been at this a long time. I know how to kind of accommodate students so that we can manage stress levels, manage time management crises, and make you feel like you're connected to an actual dialogue. And this class isn't just your laptop talking to you. So that's all preliminary, sort of setting the table. So cinematic genres, what are all of them? What are any of them? And here's my highly technical way of introducing something. So I'm holding this up. This is one of my Venn diagrams. If you've had me before, you know I'm fond of them because nothing means anything distinct unto itself. Meaning itself, as those of you who have had accounting know, when you look for the mean, you're actually not there's no such thing that is equivalent to the mean. The mean is the approximation of everything except it. So a mean is always an approximation. And when we say, what do you mean? Or what do things mean? We're saying, given all the different events, possibilities, consequences, causes, what does this mean? And it's constantly moving. So in this Venn diagram, as you will see, the outside circles, and I got to look at myself, ideology, genre, and myth are the first three, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then inside that is event, understanding, past, present, future, and then in the center, in quotes, and it's the only circle that is the product of all the other circles, and it has no meaning in itself. Meaning by definition is an approximation of of how to knot together your personal experience, your sense of history, sense of your nation, perhaps your ideology, your gender construction. We'll talk about a lot of these. All of it has to come together to a focalized sense of, oh, that's what this means. And we know in relationships and in dialogues, it's not uncommon to say to someone, what's that supposed to mean? So if someone says to you, I don't know how long I can do this, we say, what's that supposed to mean? Because it seems like a red flag and we don't know. It could mean more than one thing. And we often say that, that could mean more than one thing. Which for those things do you want that to mean? And we often say, I don't understand what you mean. I mean, which isn't to say I don't understand the English language, which we do, but understanding the syntax of what somebody said and what that person means is very different. Tonality it completely changes meaning. So you can ask me a question and I could say, yeah, sure. Or, yeah, right. Or you can ask me a question and I'm like, yeah, right. exact same words. But in the first instance, I'm agreeing with you enthusiastically. And in the second, I'm saying there's no possible way. Um, and of course, that's why texting is, as we often say, tone deaf. And that can lead to misunderstandings. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the lighting here right without blinding you. So you might text something and get a question mark back, like what? And then you have to figure it out, or else the spell correct has just translated what you said into something literally incomprehensible, or much worse, something that says something you didn't mean. So the other person won't even know it's an autocorrect, and they'll be like, "How dare you," or "I'm so insulted, and don't text me again." You're like, "What? What did I just?" Then you read it, you're like, "Oh my God, no, that's not what I meant." So the issue of what do things mean is a specific crisis of I'm just trying to, sorry, the lighting keeps changing here. It's afternoon, but I think that must be why I typically did that angle, because then I don't have that. And I can do this if I'm having a religious revelation. That's a lot about melodrama. So this is film noir, and this is melodrama. Heavenly choirs. You'll understand that better in a minute. Anyway, just trying to be poetically concise. Why is meaning such a crisis in the 20th and the 21st century, more so than, say, the Renaissance or earlier eras? And that is, as you know from 810-11, it's still relevant, that loss of transcendental certitude. So meaning is always it means something in relation to something else. Nothing can mean anything in a vacuum, because by definition, meaning is an effect of things in relationship. So when there's a kind of general consensus that there's a truth, an omniscient, omnipotent truth, whether we're in touch with it or not, the fact that there is one, then the meaning system is dictated by something above and beyond us. There's the 10 Commandments, for instance. So if somebody says you have sinned, and you say, "What do you mean?" You would say, "Well, the first, commandment is I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt put no false prophets before me," or something like that. And you've done that, so you've sinned. And the 10 Commandments come from an omniscient, omnipotent source. Moses wrote them down, but he didn't write them. And as such, they're irrefutable. And although we often think of the commandments as laws, they're not actually laws, they're commandments. The difference between a law and a commandment is that a law is man-made. And as such, slavery was once legal. Most people would agree now that it's not our best truth or our most humane way of interacting with fellow human beings. But there was a time when there was a rationale, and there was a logic, and there was a belief in the basic inferiority of races that made it appropriate and permissible to use them for labor without recompense beyond room and board to a degree, to an extent. And this permitted an economy to run. And you could further persuade yourself that they were being taken care of. They were being given a shack and food and in an ideal plantation modality. And they were benefiting somehow as much as you, as long as you believed in racial inferiority, that they weren't really capable of being leaders or having a lot of ambition or even feeling pain. So this declassification of humans through racism is very important to seeing that given what they are, quote unquote, and that becomes a racist construct, that this is the right place for them. And we don't have to defend slavery, because slavery permits capitalism. Capitalism permits us to give them a shack and a meal, and that's all they really know how to do anything with. So that kind of thinking, So laws are, well, we're watching this Texas abortion thing right now, and we can see what a game they can become. So if we have a constitution, which is kind of a political equivalent of commandments that says that a woman has a right to make decisions about her own body, and that a government should not be able to impose on that, because a lot of the Constitution is about things the government's not allowed to do, particularly the American Constitution, because it came out of the Revolutionary War, and it came out of a rebellion against monarchy. So there was a phobia about monarchical edicts that's written into the Constitution, it's written into the Bill of Rights. And we have to interpret those endlessly, but there's a lot in there about the government won't punish you for your religion, right to bear arms, which we hear a lot about, and so on. But the Texas law takes an ingenious route where it pretty much tries to pass a law that is immune to appeal, because the law specifically excludes the government from imposing laws about abortion. What it does is it empowers the fellow citizens. This is kind of virtually unique, and the Supreme Court, which also has swung right with the Trump nominations and so on. Well, one of the Supreme Court justices said that the court was burying its head in the sand, quote unquote. So they didn't strike down this new Texas law with this vague sense that, well, it's such an unusual law, we don't really, there's procedural issues. How do we strike it down since it explicitly says this is not the government? But it's pretty much vigilantism. And it's incentivized vigilantism. However you feel about abortion, that's the structure. So that's how malleable the law is. And DeSantis just got, one court said you can mandate masks in the school, and he went to get it appealed, and he apparently just got it appealed. So the law is all over the place. It doesn't help that much with what things mean in the sense of their intrinsic meaning. I mean, a law could get passed that means you could be fined $10,000 for driving a woman to an abortion clinic. That's what the law means. But that's not the meaning of the law. The meaning of the law is however you experience its effect on you. Like, do you give that ride to the clinic anyway and defy the law because it feels wrong? Do you say, I'm sorry, I can't, I don't want to go against that edict? Do you join a protest so that the edict gets removed so you can give someone a ride? You know, all of those things. But meaning in the end, what things mean, since we no longer have transcendental commandments, is what do they mean to you? And that partly is, how do they affect you? Clearly this law, I'm picking on it because it's kind of dramatic law, but it's also a really good example of what I'm trying to talk about. I don't think anyone, including the people who constructed the law, could argue that it affects men and women the same because of anatomical differences. And we're not even into feminine, masculine gender construction. Women have ovaries and can bear children, and men can't and don't. Men contribute, but they contribute in such a way that they can be they're not physically connected to gestation. So when you make laws about gestation, you're making laws that only apply to women. There's no law against, and then it gets kind of complicated, because then there's a law against rape. And people have brought up the issue of there's no provision in this law about a woman choosing to have an abortion because she was raped. And the governor's response was, well, we're going to eliminate rape in Texas. It's like, right. I said that sarcastically. Rape's not been eliminated in the written history of human civilization. It's not likely. And it's that kind of separation. Like, we don't have to protect women against rape because we will stop rape. It's a strange response, because what happens when a woman says, I'd like an abortion, I was raped? There's no such thing as rape. We've eliminated rape. You must, and this gets back to consent, that we moved all the rapists from the streets of Texas. So if you had sex, you consented. I mean, this is the kind of logic that can be brought to bear. So I'm getting a little far afield, but I maybe not as much as you might at this moment think, because modernity is a crisis of constructing meaning. And it's a war. So ideology about whether that abortion is wrong, for instance, or because the concept that if you don't want to legalize abortion, you're in favor of it is actually two different things. You personally, you might not feel you'd ever get an abortion. You might counsel the people you care about not to. You might offer to help someone so that having the child might be viable. Those are all possibilities, but there's a difference between legislating against it, making it illegal, and having your own attitude, which is why we try to use that term pro-choice. The meaning production that has to go into that choice is kind of pushed aside by legislation, by the removal of the choice. So cinema, roughly speaking, is emerging in 1895. So one thing that's kind of unique is it's an art form that's contemporaneous with the rise of modernity, unlike painting. I mean, painting changed dramatically, literature changed, sculpture, everything, all the known arts changed dramatically as a result of modernity, but they had a history going, so the novel changes, but the novel goes back to at least the 16th century, 17th century, the modern novel at least, and various other forms as well. And then we have realism in painting, naturalism, impressionism, post-impressionism. You know, we have these expressionism, these movements in painting which do register the effect of modernity, but it's on a very, very old art form. So not only did cinema emerge in 1895, but it wasn't considered in any way an art form. It was a technological novelty, the ability to have light register on emulsion, which then was made flexible so that you could take 24 photos, discrete photos, or 16 discrete photos a second. And that when those 16 photos are run together, again, through flexible film, the effect on the eye is the eye cannot distinguish that these are 16 discrete photos, so it sees movement. Technically, there's no movement in cinema. You're just watching a sequence that is so fast that the eye gives up and sees it as a movement. And so that was seen as remarkable. It was primarily seen as a scientific breakthrough. So famously, the 1904 cover of Scientific American showed a horse in mid-gallop where none of its 4 feet were touching the ground. This had been a debate among horse experts for centuries. Is there a point in the horse's gallop where no feet are touching? There was no way for the quote unquote naked eye to really tell. So it's just different experts arguing. But here, through stop action photos, was a horse in midair, and that was it. And it was proof and evidence, and it was on the cover of a Scientific American. And that was an obvious use for cinema. And when it began to enter the popular sphere, it did so strictly as a novelty, the way a lot of science things can. Like even things like going to the science center and putting your hand on the ball that makes your hair stand out. That's static electricity, and it's fun, and you can go on your school trips and do that. And cinema was really seen kind of at that level, and not really commercially viable, and pretty limited, and likely the interest in it was likely to die out. Like with it, the idea was we'd get used to going inside the movie and seeing somebody walk or run or fall down, and we'll go less and less, and cinema will kind of die out like many other carnival attractions. And early cinema was mostly shown at carnivals, often shown in tents, but the film was so incredibly flammable that after several serious fires, including deaths, showing film at carnivals was banned. Not least of all because they didn't use electricity, they used candles. So they're literally using flame right next to something flammable. They didn't have electricity, or at least they only had electricity in certain parts of major cities. They didn't have it out in the rural areas where they were also trying to show film. So it was a novelty. There was a curious advance in cinema when prohibition came in, because when alcohol became illegal in the United States, all these bars, the structure of a bar was a long, narrow room. Now, typically with a bar, it's a long, narrow room with a bar, and then people sit and face, and there's often a mirror, and then there's a bartender. But it was clearly possible to repurpose a bar to be a primitive cinema. Except instead of having it go this way, you shoot down the long way. So you put a projector here, and you put a screen there, and you put an audience facing that wall. And so there literally real estate was converted to cinema. But that raised the issue of content. Like there weren't that many movies, and how could you keep up the content? So the very first film companies, Edison among them, Edison, who was very instrumental in some of the technological inventions that made cinema, but in order to keep making money, Edison tried to run film studios, but he wasn't really an artist, and the people he hired were not artists. And so he could only do what's now called cinema of attractions. They weren't plots. So famously, he films the electrocution of an elephant. He films the demolition of a building. He films trains running into each other. Like outmoded trains would sometimes be set on a collision course on purpose so that they could film it. That would be the film. So that their sense at that time was just how can you create a spectacle? There was no idea that cinema could attract emotion. And this, of course, will become the basis of cinematic melodrama. Cinematic melodrama comes directly out of Victorian melodrama, which is arguably the high point of popular melodrama. And melodrama, which is our first genre, is a case in point that there's a compensatory quality to cinematic genre. It forms, the genre formulations occur the way they do because they're addressing a sense of a deprivation and a threat to the audience members. Because how do you get people into the theater? You need to offer them, as so much of modernity, the commodity is another example, something compensatory. This will make you feel better, at least for the duration of the consumption of the movie, or the buying of the deodorant, or the going to the mall, and so on. That for the duration of the exchange, you can feel things meaning. And you can see I'm showing my hand here. Genre helps formulate a structure within which we can discover meaning. We can discover what things mean. We can discover what they don't mean. And that moves to the second important crisis in modernity, which is the authenticity of value. In order to know what is valuable, we need to know what things mean. If we don't know what anything means, it's very hard to figure out the relative value of anything. And if we're told what things mean, implicit in our being told will be a value system. And one of the things that early capitalism was saying is that the meaning of life is acquisition and accumulation. Not just getting a job, but saving money, moving from money to capital. Capital increasingly became much more important than money. Capital begins as money, but capital is an excess money that you can reinvest. And it quickly became apparent that making enough money to eat, but nothing else, was seen as a stagnation, and in some ways seemed to be, because as the culture more and more geared itself toward capitalism, there was a catering to those who had a surfeit of cash. And then this is where Karl Marx came in and said, okay, those who own the means of production generate capital. people who have to sell their labor stay at a subsistence level. This is simplistic, but this is the point he made. That factory owners, as those of you know from Maytan and from modern times, you start an assembly line and you have people tightening 10 screws a minute, and then you speed up the assembly line and now it's 20 screws a minute, but you don't raise their salary. So you've doubled your profit as the owner of the factory. And this is where the worker was extremely vulnerable, is that their labor could be, more and more labor could be extracted from them. And Marx just compared capitalism to the vampire. And Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1895, virtually at the birth of cinema. The idea that the factory workers were living off the blood of the laborers, and that it's essentially the factory owners didn't have their own life source. Their life source was the life source of the workers. So the more labor it extracted from them while paying back less, the more it could reinvest in another factory, a bigger factory, and so on. And this is more or less the system that we still have. So cinema is an art form for the workers. Because it was a popular entertainment, because unlike theater, which is live, and you have to have a cast of people, and they're actually in the theater, and you have the overhead of theatrical lights and seating and heating the theater and so on. Theater was expensive. It was out of reach, not of the working class, and particularly of the recent immigrant working class. So cinema had to find its niche. Very few theater goers would have gone to a film in previous to, say, 1920. So for 20 years, cinema was a low form of entertainment, not really art. It was akin to going to see a vaudeville show or a clown show or something like that. So in cinema, whether they liked that or not, that was their niche. But it was quite a niche, because you had millions of recent immigrants who could afford 5 cents to go to a movie, but they could not afford $5 to go to a theater. They just wouldn't go. So, like it or not, cinema began with this kind of lowbrow audience, and as did in the Victorian theater. The Victorian melodrama was played in the cheaper theaters. So it was always a popular, melodrama itself came forward as a popular art form, because melodrama is one of the things it does most effectively is it restores a sense of meaning, which permits a sense of value. Broken Blossoms, begins in the Far East, and there's a sense of the ancient and the eternal. You have a young apprentice Buddhist who goes to temple, and Griffith is a genius with juxtaposition. He kind of introduces the power of juxtaposition in cinema. So even in the opening 5 minutes of Broken Blossoms, we go back and forth from the hushed atmosphere of a temple, and then the ringing of a very resonant bell, a gong, and he's getting advice, and he's very contemplative, and he's thinking, and then we keep cutting back and forth from that to the street, which it's more of a modern street. There's a lot of hustle going on, people coming and going quickly. And then the American soldiers, the American sailors, I guess, who are described as skylarking, and they're running around kind of without meaning. And yet we know that they are dominant, and they're an imperial force. So their meaninglessness is meaningful because it's become dominant, not because it has a lot of intrinsic meaning. Like, they don't know what they mean. And a pointless fight is staged. And Cheng Huan, who's never really called his name by anybody, but we see that his shop is Cheng Huan. So he's called the Yellow Man, or he's called the Chink, or he's called Chinky. Obviously racialized terms, to put it mildly. It doesn't seem to occur to anyone he has a name. And that'll be something more to talk about. But so he has that naive idea that he needs to bring these eternal truths to this temporal pointlessness. And we see how how that goes. He earnestly is talking to the Americans who've just started a scuffle, and they just include him in the scuffle. He just gets sucked in. And in microcosm, this movie is 1919, and in microcosm, Griffith is talking about World War I, which was just coming to a disastrous end when this movie was being made. This movie was also made during the pandemic of Spanish influenza. Lillian Gish talks about who plays Lucy, that they had to wear masks on set, and do exactly what we're doing today, where TV shows and movies. And that she said five of the people involved in the production of Broken Blossoms died of Spanish influenza during the filming. So even though this is more than 100 years ago, were coming off of the war, and they're coming off of Spanish flu, both of which gave people a lot of pause. Like, what your Western culture didn't make as much sense after the disaster of World War I. How could all of this progress and rationality have brought us to this? So melodrama really surged because it moved out of the theater and onto the screen, where it could be distributed much more effectively. But it was doing the same thing it had begun to do in the late 18th and 19th century. It was allowing people to feel. It was constructing a narrative, and this is what genre does. Genre organizes narrative in different ways. So narrative is always narrative. Narrative is a story. Genre is how the story gets told. And so sometimes the same story, and it gets back to inflection and tonality, the same story can come off in a kind of film noir, fatalistic, tragic modality. Or it can move more toward the melodrama or the Western or the romance. And we'll talk about all the differences. On a certain level, Broken Blossoms would appear to be a tragedy, that Lucy is essentially murdered by her father, and then Chen Huang shoots the father and then stabs himself, and all three are dead. And it seems to be almost a nod to Shakespearean tragedy, except what's the difference between melodrama and something like Shakespearean tragedy is melodrama is always trying to turn the attention back to the possibility of the transcendent. So it's sad when the Buddhist apprentice stabs himself, but it's also seen as an affirmation. Melodrama tries to restore the salience of sacrifice, that dying is not the worst thing. They're living like battling burros is worse than dying. And even Lucy dying, telling her father there wasn't anything wrong, and because the sexual tension of Broken Blossoms is very telling, and that's why I'm going to move right to American Beauty, which is almost a remake of Broken Blossoms, believe it or not, in the sense that a young, virginal, sexually available and attractive girl is put at the center of different forces, so that sexuality sort of stands in the place of holiness. How do you respond to beauty, as it's called in Broken Blossoms, American Beauty, and a lot of the word beauty is used in a lot of the title cards of Broken Blossoms. How do you respond to beauty? Do you revere it, which is mostly what Cheng Huan does, but even he is immediately set up with an alter ego called Evil Eye, who's also Asian, also nameless. And they're literally juxtaposed, often bookending Lucy while she's standing by the vegetables and so on. And there's a long sequence early on where going back and forth of the way Evil Eye looks at her and the way Cheng Huan looks at her. And Evil Eye is clearly kind of a proto-pimp quality to although the movie's kind of doesn't get very explicit about it. Lucy is primed for somebody to take them under her wing for prostitution, and that seems to be possibly something Evil Eye is taking a half step toward, because he sees that she wants to flower, but she doesn't have enough tin foil, and he seems to move forward with an idea of, help you just get that flower. And Cheng Huan just bumps him out of the way, and Lucy looks confused. And so at that point, Cheng Huan set himself up as a guardian of the transcendent aspect of her beauty, apart from the fact that it's also a commodity. Very early on, Griffith also gives us this kind of extra diegetic scenes, one with a harassed married woman and surrounded by children, and then another scene where she's talking to two apparent women who are street prostitutes. I forget what the title card calls it, something a little more euphemistic, but both say, don't do what we do, don't get married, don't be a prostitute. And there doesn't seem to be anything else. So she's viewed as a source of income by Evil Eye. And there's enough Buddhist training left in Cheng Huan to see her as he would like to see her, as an indication that there is a beauty in the world. This becomes a big theme in American beauty. What is there in the world that's beyond the commercial, that's beyond profit debit, beyond capital? Because capital has become so effective and so dominant that it's the only value system we have. And so you'll see a lot of attempts in Broken Blossoms, and this becomes a basis of melodrama. What is of value above and beyond commercialism and above and beyond exchange? So the fact that her mother, who left her with battling burros and disappeared somehow, left her a piece of tinfoil and a ribbon, possibly for her wedding. So that's sentiment. And she tries to translate the tinfoil into a flower, which would seem to be in line with that sentiment of a mother who didn't keep her but left her this tiny bit. And then we have the first intervention into the exchange model, like which ways in any given exchange, how much of it is quote unquote spiritual, how much of it is commercial. In capitalism, none of it's spiritual. You're a fool in capitalism if you attach the spiritual to any modes of exchange. You'll be taken advantage of. There's no point to sacrifice in a strictly capitalistic paradigm. You don't give up something for nothing. The credo of what's in it for me, what do I get out of it, is the basis of capitalism. And I'm not critiquing that, but you can't be naive in capitalism, or you will be taken advantage of. Right now, we're in a particularly aggressive capitalist modality where the world seems to be divided into winners and losers, which are both capitalistic terms. So as applied in the Trump era, a winner is someone who always walks away from an exchange with a profit, and a loser is someone who always walks away from an exchange with less. And the thing is to be a winner. If you're not a winner, you're a loser, and there's nothing else. So it wipes out any choice where you might choose to walk away from an exchange with less sacrifice, in other words. I mean, it's pretty important. The parent-child relationship in Battling Burros is obviously the worst parent one can even imagine. He thinks he's his servant and that he owns her. And the way some of those beatings are filmed also imply at least the iconography of rape, without the film saying, oh, he's having sex with his daughter. There's something about his approach, the use of that phallic whip, the way she kneels down, it's pretty uncomfortable. Like, how much is this whipping standing in for? I mean, there's nothing she ever does that remotely calls for the whipping. She accidentally spills something on his hand. And his fury at Cheng Huan, and it doesn't even occur to him that she could possibly be there for any other reason than Huan's sexual pleasure is kind of damning of the father. And even the way his friends, the other men, treat her. It's an interesting question, like where, if this particular scenario hadn't happened, stumbling out of the room badly beaten by him, stumbling into Cheng Huan's shop. He happens to be training for his next fight. Several days pass. She's venerated by Cheng Huan. He comes back and steals her back, and so on. Well, what would Lucy's life have been like had there been no Cheng Huan? She keeps saying, you'll beat me once too often, and then they'll hang you. And so beating and sexual abuse seem almost merged in particularly in the way that Griffith films it. And this is one of the things that's very powerful about cinema and very powerful about melodramas, because you have a storyline and you have visual iconography. So you can talk about you can use the word beating in some vague way, and you can sort of film rape or what appears to be a violation of her person. If you don't pay any attention to the title cards, and you look at the way Griffith films it, particularly the way he seems to like to show her in a heap on the floor after the beating, visually speaking, the difference between being beaten and being raped seem indistinguishable in a sense. So that has an effect on us as an audience. We are watching, and Hitchcock will do this in a famous shopping expedition where Scotty brings a woman to a shopping trip, and he's quite violent about making her dress up in the memory of this woman he thinks he's lost. And it's filmed like rape, and Hitchcock even said that, but it's all about whether she buys this dress or not. So there you can have multiple registers. Melodramas, of course, the roots of melodrama is about setting drama to music. Part of this came out of the Puritan theater, where plays were forbidden during a period of time when the Puritans were in the ascendancy in England. So they would have pantomimes with music, and that's the very, very beginning origins of what we now call melodrama. And that's another reason it translated so well to silent film, because you could play music while the film was playing. So there was no way for the film to have a soundtrack, but you could either tell the theater, the cinemas, what the soundtrack might be, or they had people who could play the organ and the piano who would make it up while they watched the movie, and they were often quite skillful. So they knew how to pound on the piano keys during the closet whipping scene where the axe is coming through the door, which, by the way, Kubrick borrowed wholesale for one of the greatest scenes in The Shining. The Here's Johnny scene, the axe coming through the door, the side shot, they're literally right from Broken Blossom. So kind of phenomenal that in 1919 Griffith comes up with a way of filming an axe coming through a door that Kubrick will bring to another brilliant crescendo in his own masterpiece, The Shining. It also, just to sidestep for a general point, the idea that the cinema, because it's such a young art form, still like 120 years at most, it doesn't really have a history in the same sense as painting and sculpture, although we often talk about it as though it does. So it's possible for Kubrick in 1980, in filming The Shining, to go back to a movie in 1919 and find a scene that is every bit as relevant, even though obviously there have been so many advances in movies, not least of all the Steadicam, which Kubrick used to such great effect, which Griffith never would have heard of. But this idea that camera innovation equals a step forward in cinema doesn't necessarily happen at all. Even CGI, computer-generated stuff, it can be used to good effect, but it can also be a crutch. And sound, which was seen as a huge advance, can be, but it's often also a crutch. Like the visuality becomes totally uninteresting because the characters can say how they feel. And great cinema shows you how they feel, and it shows you how they feel by making you feel the same by the way that it's shot, by the way it's edited. Griffith invents the close-up, and although he'd used it before Broken Blossoms, many see that this is his masterpiece of the close-up, and that Lillian Gish, her contribution to cinema was the art of the close-up. It's one thing to discover that you can bring the camera really close to someone's face, and it's a whole nother thing to figure out what to do with that. And the famous Lillian Gish's improvisation to not be able to smile and to use her fingers to prop up the smile. And I mean, visually speaking, it looks a little hokey now, perhaps, but it sets a it gives us a visual metaphor, trope, and then we can almost judge from scene to scene. Is she almost smiling, or is she using her fingers to smile? And then, of course, her just before she dies, she uses her fingers to try and smile at the world. It was so brutal to her. But it's also a critique of modernity and capitalism, where increasingly it doesn't, as long as you put a smile on your face, is what the father keeps demanding. And yes, she can prop up the corners of her lips, but she's not happy. She's not smiling. But as long as she looks like she's smiling, the father is willing to take that as the same. This is the sort of thing that Dorian Gray illustrates too, that to be is to be seen, and it doesn't matter what's real or true. It's about what appears to be real, what appears to be true, or even the effect of packaging, where something rather mundane can be made to seem amazing by the bright colors and by the way that it's actually packaged. So what's the value apart from appearances? That's what Cheng Huan is trying to stay in touch with. And one should nod toward the opium. In American Beauty, it'll be marijuana, but it doesn't really matter. Or Requiem for a Dream, it'll be heroin. There's a lot of alcohol, the substance is featured a lot in melodrama, because addiction is a substitution for religious ritual. So Cheng Huan falls victim to that. He kind of loses his faith and he turns to opium, but then he seems to drop that and come back to faith when after coming home, probably still high from an opium smoking, he discovers her on his rug as if she were a gift from God, and he kind of seems to take it that way. This is his chance to get back to his spiritual roots, which he will, even up to the point where he stabs himself. There's a sense that he's dying in homage to a return to spirituality, because obviously death is the only thing that can possibly happen to him anyway. All these white men are coming to arrest a Chinese and Asian man for the murder of a white man at a time where executions were far more common. So it's not, his life is going to be ended. So we really are watching him do it on his own terms, as a kind of so that he can die back in a spiritual position. And in a way, the movie seems to endorse that by cutting away from him back to the gong in the temple, and which we haven't seen this whole movie, and suddenly we're back to that. And a great parallelism, and the movie operates on parallels in ways we can get into on Monday night. But the relationship between the temple gong and the bell for the boxing, Griffith goes back and forth. So the bell is very sharp. It's like bing. We can't. Well, you can hear in the soundtrack, at least you can. And probably an organ person would have had a way to hit a note when the bell was being struck. So chances are you would have, even back in 1919, you'd have heard them something like bing. And then there seems to be more resonant mong, to the temple bell. And we're shown the difference between this fascination of the crowd. The boxing match scenes are, again, extraordinary. And Scorsese has credited them with some of the ways that he staged Raging Bull with Robert De Niro, which again is kind of astonishing. You think of the difference in technical capacity that he would see something in Griffith. And one of the things that Griffith does, boxing matches had been filmed before, actual boxing matches, and even some staged ones. They didn't involve the audience, and half the footage of those boxing scenes is of people in the audience. It didn't occur to anybody that if you're going to be drawn into the feelings evoked in a boxing match, that the filmmaker should have a substitute for you inside the shot. In this case, the all men, of course, audience, and the lust in their own eyes, and the degree to which they want to identify with just beating something down, beating something up. And it endorses a certain, I mean, now we have MMA and ultimate fighting, and something that's a little bit, I mean, we still sort of have boxing, but the ultimate fighting seems a more dominant form, where all the rules are kind of removed, and the referee doesn't stop until the other person either taps out or looks like they're now, about to be permanently injured. The brutality of the ultra fighting, whatever we're calling it, is also indicative of an increased, because there's really two directions to go. If you keep tightening the ratchet effect of what it means to be a winner, and the phobia about being a loser, and the false dilemma that you're either one or the other, and then you tailor that, you connect that to masculinity, then you've got not just the fighting, but the meeting of the fighters before the match seems to be often as or more important than the fight. They need to hate each other, whether they do or not. Professional wrestling turns this into a kind of sort of hyper masculine ballet, and it seems like 50% of professional wrestling is smack talk, just like going on and on about what you're going to do to the other person. And our superhero movies seem to have picked up on this, like just talking so much about the fight that's going to occur. And maybe it's just me, but it's like, just fight, stop talking about it. I remember the Pokemon, or some of the shows my kids used to watch, they'd spend the whole show like, what I'm going to do to you. Oh yeah, here's what I'm going to do to you. I'm like, just do it or don't do it. I wasn't very welcome hanging around my kids watching these shows. But so I'm conscious of the time, and this is meant to just open things up. And I think I probably said enough at this point to further locate you in relation to your actual viewing of the film, at least the first several pages of the document that's posted. And then I will have our open class this coming Monday, 7 to 9. And I'll write this out for you, but my prompt for you is going to be to see if you can find any advertisement that appears to be trying to align its product to something above and beyond the commercial. So the paradox of, it could be a car, but is there an appeal to the transcendent that's being embedded in the acquisition of the product? And I'll see if I can't give you an example or two myself. So look under the discussion section. I haven't done this yet, and see if you can get a single ad and a brief 300 words or so, because what ads are melodramatic to the extent that they try and have it both ways. Like, you have to purchase this and you have to have money in order to get it. But part of what will sell you is the transcendence that you're so starved for, because it's actually nowhere represented. Is the product offering the experience of sacrifice without the fact of it, for instance? So again, I'll come up with a example or two myself. This early in the course, I wouldn't worry too much. And you can even spend the 300 words saying, I'm not sure. That's all right. I just want you to engage it. So look for that prompt. I'm going to sign off for now. Remember, Leonard Gary at hotmail.com. Let's get this class off the ground. It seems a little bit harder to leverage it through this medium, but A for effort. Let's get it done. So I will open this up this Monday at 7. We can take on more questions, everything from specific things about midterm percentage points or whatever to the place of sacrifice in and meaning and value. Because I guess just to do a final focus, if I had to have 3 key words for this lecture, and I've used them a lot, is sacrifice, meaning, and value. Because in capitalism, meaning and value are generated by acquisition. In melodrama, meaning and value are generated by sacrifice. You learn what matters by losing, by giving up. And in that sense, it's the opposite of capitalism. So I'll pause there and look forward to seeing you guys this Monday at 7. Okay, bye for now.